it is pretty much impossible to recommend movies that are produced these days wholesale, and that's not what I'm doing. But one of my favorite trilogies of movies is the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And there is a scene in the third movie that is particularly stirring called The Last Ride of the Rohirrim. And in this scene, one kind of region or country, you could say, is coming to the defense of another that is being attacked. And it seems like all hope is lost when this country shows up, and they show up at the top of this hill, and they're blowing the horns, and then this stirring speech is given, and then they all ride down this hill to meet the enemy. And again, it's particularly stirring and particularly inspiring. And yet, you know, as stirring as inspiring as that scene is, as they are showing great courage and they are riding down this hill to meet this large army, I think about some times in the Bible where if a movie were to be made about what happened then, honestly, what happened in the movie that I was just describing would kind of pale in comparison. And I want to go to one of those passages today and look at some of these things. And I want to talk to you about David's mighty men in 2 Samuel 23. The things that these men did, if they were to be put in movie form, would make a lot of the things that have been put in movies pale in comparison. But these things that we're going to be reading about today in 2 Samuel 23 are not there for entertainment value. Sure, they can be entertaining to read, and I'm not doubting that at all. But they're not there for entertainment value. Rather, they're for our learning. They are for things that we can learn from and we can make application to our lives from. And so as I'm talking about these great men and talking about the amazing things they did, yes, you can be stirred and you can kind of go, wow, that's amazing. But don't forget that we are learning from these men, and we will make application at the end. When you talk about David's mighty men, you're talking about men who are loyal to King David. David being the second king of the United Nation of Israel. And David himself was a great warrior, and yet he had a number of men who he trusted as great warriors. And these men are talked about in a couple places, 2 Samuel 23 being one, and 1 Chronicles 11 being the other. And these are very much parallel, so we will be mostly in 2 Samuel 23 this morning. So what did these men do that earned them the title of mighty men? Well, starting in verse 8, we read of a man who I will be using his easier name, Adino the Eznite. It says in chapter 23, verse 8, "These are the names of the mighty men whom David had: Josheb-Basshebeth, Tachmahenite, chief of the captains. He was called Adino the Eznite because of 800 slain by him at one time." So we have Adino the Eznite. He has a more difficult name that I'm not going to pronounce again. And he is known as being one who slayed 800 men at one time. Now you think about certain other feats like this. For example, Shamgar had, I believe, 600 Philistines where he slayed that with an ox goad. You think about Samson, who slayed, I believe, 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. And yet, here is a man who slayed 800. And so, right up there with some of those great judges that we talk about is Adino the Eznite. And he is chief of the captains. As we will talk about David's structure of his army, he has these mighty men are called the 30. And we'll talk about that title later on. But of all the men that were in David's army, chief among the 30 was Adino the Eznite. He was the most honored, the top of all of them. He may not have been commander, but he was the most honored or most valiant of all of them. And then after him was a man by the name of Eleazar. In verse 9 it says, "And after him was Eleazar the son of Dodo the Ahohite, one of the 3 mighty men with David, when they defied the Philistines who were gathered there to battle, and the men of Israel had withdrawn. He arose and struck the Philistines until his hand was weary, and clung to the sword, and the Lord brought about a great victory that day. And the people returned after him only to strip the slain." Eleazar is the second among the chief men. He would be, there are, among David's 30, there are 3 who are the most honored, Adino being the chief among those, and then the next would be Eleazar. And we're told of an instance where Eleazar was up with David and other mighty men and the whole nation of Israel, the whole army of Israel. And yet, something happens where the whole army of Israel withdraws. And it's not exactly clear if Eleazar is standing by himself or if he's standing with himself and the 2 other mighty men and David. But even if it's 4 people standing there instead of 1, what he does is quite impressive. As the men of Israel are withdrawing, Eleazar decides, no, we're not withdrawing today. I'm going to stand firm. And he pretty much single-handedly wins the battle on that particular day. His whole army had withdrawn, and yet he continued to stay there. And he fought for so long, it says that his hand clung to the sword. Now, I had a similar thing happen to me, not in battle. In fact, it was much more pathetic than that. I was working out and I was wearing these gloves, and I decided to lift some heavy weights with them. And after I had lifted these heavy weights, because of the gloves cutting off blood supply or something, my hand would not open back up for a few minutes afterward. Again, far more pathetic than what Eleazar had done, but I can tell you about the phenomenon. Imagine holding on to something for so long that your hand just does not open up afterward. His hand clung to the sword, it said. And that's what Eleazar did when he struck the Philistines and brought about a great victory. And then the final of the big 3, I guess you could say, is a man by the name of Shammah. In verse 11 it says, "Now after him was Shammah, the son of Agi, a Hararite, and the Philistines were gathered into a troop where there was a plot of the ground full of lentils, and the people fled from the Philistines. But he took his stand in the midst of the plot, defended it, and struck the Philistines, and the Lord brought about a great victory." So similar to what Eleazar did, on another instance, they were in this field where there's a plot of ground full of lentils, and the people started fleeing, the people ran away, but Shammah took his stand in this plot of ground, and he defended it, and he brought about a great victory. And yet, I want you to notice something that it says both in verse 12 as well as verse 10. It wasn't just these men. Certainly these men showed great valor and great courage, but notice in verse 10, it says, "And the Lord brought about a great victory that day," talking about what Eleazar did. And once again in verse 12, "And the Lord brought about a great victory." And so the Lord was fighting for them. Yes, these men showed great courage and great valor, but let us not take away the Lord's great part in these victories as well. And so these are, again, what I would call the big 3. The 3 chiefest of all the mighty men of David: Adino the Eznite, Eleazar, and Shammah. And yet, there are still some more who garnered praise. In the next set of verses, we have 3 of the 30 chief men. And I'm not sure whether this is the 3 that we've already talked about or another set of 3. My leaning is toward that it is the 3 chief men. But listen to what they did. In verse 13 it says, Then 3 of the 30 chief men went down and came to David in the harvest time to the cave of Adullam. While the troop of the Philistines was camping in the valley of Rephaim, David was then in the stronghold, while the garrison of the Philistines was then in Bethlehem. David had a craving and said, Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate. So the 3 mighty men broke through the camp of the Philistines and drew water from the well of Bethlehem, which was by the gate, and took it and brought it to David. Nevertheless, he would not drink it, but poured it out to the Lord. And he said, Be it far from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Shall I drink the blood of the men who went in jeopardy of their lives? Therefore, he would not drink it. These things the 3 mighty men did. So David, being from Bethlehem, is essentially craving his hometown water. But there's a problem, and that's the Philistines' garrison is in Bethlehem. They've set up their stronghold, so to speak, in Bethlehem. But David has this craving, and he makes it known out loud, Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate. And my guess is that he didn't really mean anything of this. But one thing that I learned from this story and from other stories is that, yes, David is a mighty man, and yes, David is a man after God's own heart, but also David is perhaps a little bit dramatic. But this is what he said. Well, his 3 mighty men hear this, and they go and they break through this camp of Philistines to get David his water. And after they go through all that trouble, David does not want to drink it because his men risked their lives for it. And to us, the practicality of that, well, they've already risked their lives. Why would you not drink it? I'm trying not to be too hard on David for what he decides to do, to pour it out to the Lord there. But it's an amazing thing that these 3 men did, that they broke through a whole garrison, a whole stronghold of Philistines, just because David wanted some water. And then we have a man by the name of Abishai. And as we're going through this list, you probably noted that Adino, the Eznite, Eleazar, Shammah, those are not names that you would typically think of when you think about David. Honestly, when you read the rest of David's narrative, these names don't really show up. But Abishai's does. Abishai is David's nephew. He is brother of Joab, Joab being the commander of David's army. And Abishai is mentioned in verses 18 and 19. Abishai, the brother of Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was chief of the 30. And he swung his spear against 300 and killed them, and had a name as well of the 3. He was most honored of the 30, therefore he became their commander. However, he did not attain to the 3. All right, there's a little bit of confusing language there, and I can't profess to understand all of it, but I understand enough. Abishai, he's chief of the 30. And you might think, well, wouldn't that be Joab? No. Joab was commander of the whole army. This 30 seemed to be an elite force intermixed within that whole army. And of the 30, Abishai was the chief. And you might think, well, wouldn't that be Adino? Well, Adino was the most honored and perhaps the most valiant. But he was not the chief. He was not the commander. That belonged to Abishai. And we're told about Abishai that he swung his spear against 300 and killed them. So he took out 300 men all at once. And it mentions that he was the most honored of the 30. I assume that means excluding the 3, because it says right after that, he became their commander. However, he did not attain to the 3. So there were 3 among the 30, the 3 that we've mentioned before, and they had chiefest status. But then right after that would be Abishai, their commander. And then another name that is a little bit more familiar is Benaiah. It says in verse 20, that Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, the son of a valiant man of Kabzeel, who had done mighty deeds, killed the 2 sons of Ariel of Moab. He also went down and killed a lion in the middle of a pit on a snowy day. He killed an Egyptian, an impressive man. Now the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, but he went down to him with a club and snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. These things Benaiah the son of Jehoiada did, and had a name as well as the 3 mighty men. He was honored among the 30, but he did not attain to the 3, and David appointed him over his guard. Okay, so we're told about Benaiah, and if that name sounds familiar to you, probably the most notable thing that we know that Benaiah did, other than what is mentioned here, is when Solomon becomes king, it is Benaiah who Solomon sends to dispatch of people who are causing problems for Solomon, or really who caused problems for David. Joab being one of them that Benaiah puts to death. Shimei, who cursed David as well. And also Solomon's own brother, who tried to take the kingship from him as well. So Benaiah was among these mighty men. And it mentions multiple things that he had done. He killed the 2 sons of Ariel of Moab, and we have no idea who this person is or why this is impressive, but perhaps people of the day would have read this and said, these 2 sons of Ariel were particularly mighty warriors, maybe in the same way we think of Goliath. And yet Benaiah was the one who killed them. He killed a lion in the middle of a pit on a snowy day. And we're not told why, but presumably he had good reason to be going toe-to-toe with a lion. And he killed this lion in the middle of a pit. He also killed an Egyptian, and this Egyptian is said to be an impressive man. Most likely strong and again, seemingly kind of like Goliath, a warrior. And it says how he killed this Egyptian, that this Egyptian had a spear. He goes down with the club, but he is able to just grab the spear and take it away from him. Now this Egyptian was an oppressive man, and by the use of that impressive, we think probably a man of war. And yet, what he does is he makes this impressive man look like child's play. He takes his own weapon from him. That's not something that you can typically do to a soldier, and yet Benaiah did. It says that he was honored among the 30. He did not attain to the 3, and then it says David appointed him over his guard. You would think that, like most kings, David had his own personal bodyguards, so to speak. That seems to be what is being talked about in verse 23. And Benaiah was over them. He was overseer of David's guard. And then we have a bunch of other names here. And I am going to read these. It will be difficult for me to get through all of them. But these men are noted as David's mighty men. And I want to read these. And we'll talk about a few of them after I read them. So starting in verse 24. Asahel, the brother of Joab, was among the 30. Elhanan, the son of Dodo of Bethlehem. Shammah the Harodite. Elika the Harodite. Helez the Paltite. Ira the son of Ikesh the Tekoite. Abiezer the Anathothite. Mabani the Hashathite. Zalman the Ahoite. Maharai the Netophathite. Heleb the son of Bana the Netophathite. Ittai the son of Ribai of Gibeah of the sons of Benjamin. Benaiah a Parathonite. Hiddai of the brooks of Gaash, Abi-Alban, the Arbathite, Asmatheth, the Barhumite, Elihaba, the Shalbonite, the sons of Jashan, Jonathan, Shammah the Hararite, Ahiam the son of Sharar the Hararite, Elephalet, the son of Ahashabai, the son of the Maacathite, Eliam, the son of Ahithophel the Gilonite, Hezro the Carmelite, Harai the Arbite, Igal the son of Nathan of Zobah, Bani the Gadite, Zelek the Ammonite, Naharai the Beerothite, armor bearers of Joab the son of Zeruiah, Ira the Ithrite, Gareb the Ithrite, Uriah the Hittite. 37 in all. So we have multiple names mentioned here, and I want you to note that it says 37 in all at the end. And when you go and look at the list in Chronicles, you can count up to around 50 men. And the 30 is not an exact number. Rather, what I would suggest and what others have suggested is that the 30 was an elite squad whose members rotated or, sometimes they needed to be replaced. For example, Asahel, the brother of Joab, we know that he was killed by Abner even before David becomes king of all Israel. And so Asahel would have been needed to be replaced among the 30. Later on, Uriah the Hittite, who is mentioned in verse 39, yes, he was a mighty man. He was of the 30. But of course, David had him put to death in battle. But Uriah would have had to have been replaced. And so this 30 is not talking about 30 specific men, but rather a group of 30 men who were among the elite. And sometimes those names changed. Sometimes those needed to be rotated out or replaced in some certain cases. But I want you to notice something else among this list. It seems like a lot of these are indeed Gentiles. Uriah the Hittite would be one. Zelek the Ammonite would be another. And then when we start getting to Ahoites and Netophathites and things like that, quite frankly, I'm not 100% sure if those are Gentiles or not. We do see some that are indeed Israelites and easy to identify as Israelites. For example, Ittai, the son of Ribai of Gibeah of the sons of Benjamin, he would have been an Israelite. But some of these men are Gentiles. And yet, their loyalty to David, loyalty to their king, went even across that barrier as well. So now that we've looked at these men and some of the great feats that they had done, I want to ask, what can we learn from these men? What lessons can we learn from these mighty men of valor? One thing that I want to impress upon you is that one person can indeed make a difference. We see a couple cases here in the text where one person was the difference between victory and defeat. Eleazar, when the Philistines caused the Israelites to retreat, Eleazar stood and he slew the Philistines until his hand clung to the sword. But then Shammah at another time stood in the middle of a field as the Israelites were retreating, and he defended that field and brought about great victory. What if those men had decided, like everybody else, to retreat? Well, then it would have been defeat. Then perhaps other people would have died because of that defeat and retreat. Perhaps David himself would have died if not for these men stepping in. If you would, turn over to Ezekiel chapter 22 for just a moment. Understand, yes, I am talking about physical warfare as far as these men are concerned. But in application, I'm not talking about physical warfare at all. I'm talking about spiritual warfare. In Ezekiel chapter 22, God has already brought about judgment upon Israel, and He's going to bring more. And He's telling Ezekiel about it. He's telling the Israelites about it. And this is what the Lord said about Israel and Judah at that time. He says in verse 30, I searched for a man among them who would build up the wall and stand in the gap before me for the land, so that I would not destroy it, but I found no one. Thus I have poured out my indignation on them. I have consumed them with the fire of my wrath. Their way I have brought upon their heads, declares the Lord. God was searching even for one man who would stand in the gap. Is He talking about physical warfare here? No. He's talking about spiritual warfare. He's talking about somebody standing up for righteousness when all this wickedness is going on. And you can see the wickedness in the previous verses. For example, verse 26, her priests have done violence to my law and have profaned my holy things. They have made no distinction between the holy and the profane, and they have not taught the difference between the unclean and the clean. And they hide their eyes from my Sabbaths, and I am profaned among them. This is what God is talking about. He's saying, there's great wickedness among Judah. There was great wickedness among my people. And I was searching for one person. Even one person who would build up the wall and stand in the gap, who would make a stand for righteousness. But what does God say? I found no one. Look, standing for what is right in spiritual warfare can be very lonely. There can be times where you might expect people would stand up and say, this is wrong. And what you find out is that a lot of people are not willing to rock the boat. A lot of people are willing to keep the status quo. A lot of people are willing to keep silent for the sake of not offending people. But even if that happens, even if you find yourself to be on an island, so to speak, the only one, make sure that you are the only one. And that you too don't turn tail and run. Be like Eliezer. Be like Shammah. Be like what God is searching for here in Ezekiel 22. Be willing to stand in the gap. You can make a difference. With the Lord at your side, and we talked about earlier in both of those cases, it says the Lord brought about victory. If you're the one willing to stand in the gap, God is going to be at your side, and you can bring about victory. Don't forget that. Another thing that we can learn, and I pose this in the form of a question, is do we have as much zeal for our king as these men did for their king? Turn with me to 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel 22. I want to take you back to seemingly where it all started. First Samuel 22, starting in verse 1. This is where David is on the run from Saul. He has not even been officially crowned king yet. 1 Samuel 22, verse 1. So David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's household heard of it, they went down there to him. Everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. And he became captain over them. Now there were about 400 men with him. I would suggest to you that some, if not all, of David's mighty men came to him at this time. At the very least, it says that his brothers and his father's household went down there to him. If I understand correctly, that would probably include Joab and Abishai and Asahel, three of David's mighty men, although Joab is not mentioned. He's commander of David's army. But Abishai and Asahel are mentioned, and seemingly they would have come to him here. But there were about 400 men with him. It's kind of hard for me to think that among those 400 that not one of them would have been David's mighty men, most loyal. And so at least some of them came down at this point. But notice what it says about why they came to David. It says, everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. Saul's reign in Israel was extremely problematic in a lot of ways. He was not uniting Israel as they had hoped. He was the king they deserved when they asked the Lord to make them a king, get them a king. And so in Saul's reign, as he reigns and he just kind of does whatever he wants, there are these people who are in distress and in debt and discontented. And they know this is not the way that things should be. So a lot of these men came and rallied to David during the reign of Saul, and they remained loyal to him all his days. If you turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 11. 1 Chronicles chapter 11, which is the parallel account of what we just read in 2 Samuel 23. 1 Chronicles 11 verse 10, it says, "Now these are the heads of the mighty men whom David had, who gave him strong support in his kingdom, together with all Israel, to make him king according to the word of the Lord concerning Israel." It says that these men gave him strong support in his kingdom. I want you to think about the men who heard David say that he wanted to drink from the well in Bethlehem. Again, maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh on David, but it seems a little bit dramatic. And it seems like it's also ill-timed. Of course, he knows that the Philistines are stationed in Bethlehem. And he wants to draw a drink of water from that well right then and there. But these three men, they hear that. They hear that he's longing for the water from his hometown. And they're stirred enough to go, the three of them, charge a garrison full of Philistines and get him that drink of water. Just amazing dedication. Is there anybody that we're loyal to in the same way? Well, when it comes to it, we should be that loyal to, and even above and beyond that, for Jesus. You see, we came to Jesus too out of weariness, out of discontentment, and in the debt of sin. And we recognize Him as King in our lives. We recognize that He is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so, we ourselves should be willing to do whatever He asks. Jesus doesn't have unreasonable requests, but if Jesus were to ask for a drink of water from Bethlehem and there was a garrison of Philistines in our way, would we have that same zeal? It's a good question for us to ask ourselves. Do we have the same loyalty and zeal for our King as these men did? Can it be said of us that we give Jesus strong support in His kingdom? If not, why not? Now, as I've said before, we're not asked to go fight physical battles. That's not the kind of kingdom that Jesus has. He makes that clear in John 18. My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my subjects, my followers would be fighting for me that I might be delivered. Jesus doesn't expect us to fight physical battles. Rather, we're fighting in some ways harder spiritual battles. Battles against Satan. Battles against principalities and powers. And yet, we have our King, Jesus. He's fighting with us. And He's fighting for us. And if the Lord is with us, who dares stand against us? And even if we find ourselves to be alone, the Lord is still fighting for us. So we need to realize that the battle belongs to the Lord. And we as His loyal subject, we as His mighty men, need to be willing to fight. Need to be willing to take a stand. We need to be loyal to Him no matter what the cost. This morning, as we close, I'd ask you, are you loyal to the King? Perhaps you have not joined yourself to His cause yet. If you haven't, why not? Is it because you don't understand that Jesus is Lord? Is it because you don't understand that Jesus is King? Well, I'd be happy to talk about that with you further. But if you understand that Jesus came to this earth, that He died on the cross, was buried, and was raised on the third day, and that He ascended to heaven and sat down at the right hand of God, you understand that He's King. You understand that He's Lord. And so you must act upon that reality. You must do whatever He commands, whatever He says, you do. And Jesus said to believe in Him. Believe that He is the Christ, the Son of God. You must repent of your sins. You must be willing to confess Him before men. And you must be baptized for the remission of sins. Being baptized is joining His army, in a way of speaking. It is joining yourself to the cause of Christ. It is becoming His disciple. And once you have joined yourself to Him, you must live faithfully to Him the rest of your days. Obey your King's command. If you haven't obeyed the gospel, you have an opportunity in just a moment as we sing this invitation song. And if you have obeyed the King's command to be baptized, but you haven't been living faithfully to Him in your life, or you've been struggling, you've been discouraged, right now is a good opportunity for you to make that right. To come forward and ask for the prayers of the saints so that we can rally around you and lift you up to God, who is faithful and just to forgive any sins that you may commit, and you can rededicate your life to the King. So if you have any need this morning, won't you stand while we sing?